Hi, welcome to another exciting edition of Color Me Poetry. This is Poet Danny Queen, your host, and I have with us today a young lady who I've known for many years, and she's been to Africa 500,000,000 times. And she is none other than Atlantis Browder, and she's the wonderful daughter of my good friend Tony Browder, who I've known for many years. Matter of fact, Tony and you and your dad, y'all used to come down to Bowie and do my show back in the 90s.
Yes.
You was like little.
About eight, maybe
But
eight, 9 years old.
Yes,
Yeah.
because I've known you before that, really. And so, tell me this: who is Atlantis Browder?
Atlantis Browder. Who am I? I feel that I'm certainly defined by many of the roles that I've taken on. I am a daughter, a granddaughter, a sister,
Wow.
an auntie, a cousin. But I'm also an educator.
As well.
Also
Yes.
a historian and an author. And so all of those titles, so to speak, essentially reflect who I am, because the experiences that I've gotten out of all of those things have helped me to become who I am.
And a brilliant roundaway sister, y'all. Yes, but you've been. I mean, let's talk with your dad, and because we can't just talk. But I want to talk about everything. But your dad, since you were a little kid, introduced you to
Absolutely. And
African culture.
Yeah, he introduced me to African history and culture at such an early age. One of the
Yes.
reasons was because my father didn't learn about African history and culture until he graduated from an HBCU, Howard University. And not only that, but he also grew up not knowing who his biological father was. And so although his mother did an excellent job raising him as well as other members of the family, but he didn't have someone to teach him who he was as a person of African ancestry. And so it wasn't until he graduated from college, got exposed to this information, and he sought out male role models to help mold him and teach him.
That's interesting, because I know I was in like high school, and we had Black History, like Bowie High School. At that time, we had Black History like once a week, on every Friday.
Okay.
And
Black History once a week.
Once a week.
That's unheard.
And we learned about that's where I first learned about the Harlem Renaissance, and of course through independent study and that kind of thing. I found out about the Honorable Marcus Garvey, and so many people as a young person coming up, and it would just open a whole nother world to me, really. Before I got to college, it was just so much that I hadn't been taught, that I didn't know. And so when I got to study and learn about African history and culture and tradition, it was like your dad. It was like years later. But I came into it, people suggesting books and talking to people. You grew up, if you're not exposed to it, you don't know.
Absolutely.
But when you come into that knowledge of yourself, that awareness of yourself, and that's what I have learned from you and learned from your dad. I used to record lectures for your dad when you were little, when he would bring all the scholars to the town for the Cosmic Institute of Cosmic God back in the day. And that started me to, he would bring all the scholars like Dr. Asa Head and many, Dr. Richard King, Dr. Clark, Dr. Ben. He would bring all these people to town. And they would give lectures, and they would call me in to record them. I remember that years ago, and that started me on my way, because I wasn't just there as a professional recording that lecture at that time, but I also was a student of life, and that's how I got started. I'm like, oh, these guys are talking stuff I've never heard. So I started buying the books and doing some independent research, so I owe a great debt of gratitude to your dad, Tony Browder. But not just me. I'm sure he's helped a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting you say that, because it wasn't until I went away to college in 2000. I started off at Hampton University. And, of course, I'm familiar with my dad locally in the DMV. People know him and know his work.
People know him everywhere.
But going away to college, being hours away from home, but meeting people who were, around my age that had, read my father's books.
From the Browder files.
From the Browder file. They were familiar with his work. And, I would tell them who I was, or they would find out my last name and, just get so excited. Anthony Browder's your father. And, I didn't see the big deal at the
Yeah,
time.
you thought everybody did.
Yeah, right. But I think what hit me the most was that they shared that, although they had never met my father,
Yes.
but how much his works, his books had changed their lives. And so, for me,
Wow.
that reminded me of what I wanted to do. Since I was 6 or 7 years old, I remember always wanting to be just like my father.
But how does that feel as a young person, knowing that other kids your age revered your dad and his work?
Well, I mean, as a teenager,
Yeah.
as a young adult,
Yeah.
I think I learned to appreciate him more. I knew him as father.
Yeah, he was his dad to you.
Everybody else,
Yeah.
he's Dr. Browder, a scholar.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
of course, I saw all of those qualities, but I didn't really appreciate it and really make those connections until I got
Later.
a little bit older.
That's usually how it is in the family, though, isn't it? I don't care how great you are, or how great other people think you are, but to family members, oh, that's just my brother, that's my uncle, yeah, my crazy uncle, yeah, that's my dad. But I mean, you know what I'm saying? It's not. That's just the way it always is, And as the book says, sometimes the prophet is not recognized in his own home. Yeah. So it's interesting. So first there was the Browder Fall, and then what came after? Was it?
Now Valley.
Now Valley. Oh wow, let's talk about. I love this cover. I got a poster too that I got from your dad. If we could get a close up on this would be wonderful. But I should have bought that poster. I forgot to bring it.
Michael Brown, if I'm not mistaken,
Michael
Brown did the cover.
Mike's a bad boy.
Yeah.
Shout
As
out
an
to Michael
artist.
Brown. Go on with your bad self. Because this is, oh man, when I saw this cover. What's more, now this is new one I just bought a couple weeks ago when you had your book signing.
Okay.
I bought this one and of course I bought yours. But the original one that I bought, I couldn't bring because there's all the pages all, bent
But
up.
those are the best books because it shows that you've been reading and studying.
That's the one I couldn't find. So let me bring the new one. But no, that the one I'm not right. Because at the time, I was still in college, so I would write on the margins, making notes in the margins and that kind of thing. But even professors at school weren't familiar with it. Yeah, some of them weren't familiar with it at all. But this here, shout out to your dad. That's a mess. That's some masterpiece there. It really
Yeah,
is.
I actually at Hampton University, I had one professor who used his books. So,
Oh, really?
that was an interesting experience for me.
Really? And he knew that you were his daughter?
Yes, yes. he did.
Wow, and he used it in his class?
Absolutely.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah. Now let's talk about your book and your history, and as a young person, and your first trip to Africa, and how'd your dad? I mean, was it hard for your dad to introduce you to it?
Well,
But as a young person,
I wouldn't say it was hard.
Mhm.
I think it was a natural process for him because African history and culture, specifically Kemetic or Egyptian history and culture, he was very passionate about. And so it wasn't difficult
wouldn't
for
say
him
hard,
to
yeah.
pass it
No.
on to me. But like I said earlier, he saw to it that and knew that as my father, it was his responsibility to teach me this information. He couldn't depend on the school systems. Even though I went to a great public elementary school, we didn't have Black History Month celebrations every Friday. But as I got older, my father put me into private schools, Catholic schools, and Seventh-day Adventist schools, and so in most instances,
they wasn't teaching
this information was not
Yeah,
going
they
to be
wasn't gonna teach you
reinforced.
this. I grew up as a Catholic, and they weren't teaching this. Of course, they weren't teaching this. So yes, by your dad being the person that he is, he brought you into this as a child. That's the beautiful thing. What does that mean when you think about children? In our community in general, that your dad would introduce you to this knowledge,
Well,
even at that young age.
I have to say, very early on, and it didn't take me too long to realize that my reality was a little bit twisted, but I actually thought every child had a father like mine who had traveled and, wrote books. And of course, I soon learned that was not the case. And I realized that my upbringing was very special. Not only because I was exposed to this information early on, but being raised by a single father, whereas many of my peers growing up were raised either by a single mother or they might have had both parents in the household. But I really respected my father for owning up to his responsibility as a man, but seeing to it in every way possible, to the best of his ability at that time, that he would make sure my foundation was solid in terms of understanding who I was and loving myself as a person of African ancestry.
That's number one.
Absolutely.
The late great mentor of mine, Dr. Francis Cress Wilson, always said, self-respect is the most powerful weapon in the world. She said your self-respect should be like a laser beam. She says there's no price you can put on a person's self-worth. She said that all the time. And she also said, it's more important to read than to watch TV. She said
and that's one thing that I always saw my father doing. He was always reading
all
books,
the time.
magazines, newspapers. But he had a natural love and desire to learn. So I think that was most inspiring for me, that he not only told me what to do, but modeled everything that he expected of me.
Wow. And as a young person, that's something, you know. Now, your first trip to Africa, you had been there a couple of times before? Well, no. Your first trip to Africa, what was that like?
So my first trip to Africa was in 1989.
And you were?
When I was 7 years old.
Wow.
And yeah, 30 years, right? 31 years. And so I traveled, I made that trip with my father, my grandmother, and about 31 other people.
Oh,
and,
wow.
You know, like I said, my father wanted to take me on this trip because he wanted to make sure that I knew who I was as a person of African ancestry. And it's one thing to read books about African history and culture and see the architecture, but it's a completely different thing to be able to go there and see it for yourself.
For yourself.
And touch.
At 7?
You know, at 7 years
old. At 7 years old. Wow. At 7, what were your thoughts? You know, because that was your first time going, period,
to
right?
Africa, yes,
Yeah.
my first trip to Africa. And, you know, of course, a lot more things clicked for me after the trip, and as I got older and as I made many trips back to Egypt. But most importantly, I think on a subconscious level, was to remind me, give me constant reminders, and even something as simple as symbolism. I remember at a very early age, my favorite symbol was the Ankh. I would always draw it in my notebooks when I got bored. And so as I've become older, I've come to understand the importance of symbols.
Symbols are very important.
They're not just images, some fancy little design, but they have messages. And only to the trained eye can you be able to read what these messages are and use them to inspire you or for whatever purpose that they may serve.
Wow, and there's so many images, like the one that I have on, like the one that you have on, or the Ankh.
The Eye of Heru.
Yes. And as a young person, that must have been something else. Boy, if I was introduced to this at 7 years old, ooh, man. But, so the book came how much longer after you made your first trip?
So actually, shortly after returning from my first trip to Africa, a family friend of ours, Sharon Smith, shout out to Sharon Smith, who's in Georgia, she actually suggested the idea to write a book about my travels and called it My First Trip to Africa. So this is 1989. And this same year, earlier in February, my father had published his first book, From the Browder File. So,
which was a collection of essays.
Exactly. And so, as I mentioned, I'd always wanted to be just like my father and walk in his footsteps. So the idea to write a book was a perfect opportunity for me to continue that work.
Well, because I remember I used to read his essays, columns at the time, if you will, and I think it was in the not the Washington Post, in the Afro. The Afro at that time. And I used to always collect them. Before he ever put a book, I said, this brother's on to something. So, you know, I used to collect it. And then when he came up with the Browder Files, I was like, wow, okay. And how long since the Browder Files been on?
30, or so it was, came out in 1989, so last year, 30 years, celebrated 30 years.
And the first trip to Africa first came out?
So it was published in 90.
So you've had quite a few printings since then.
Absolutely. Right. And it was actually from that book that I helped to pay for my college tuition. So, you know, not only is my father introducing me to history and culture, but he's teaching me about finances, how to become responsible with money. And
that's a lesson in itself.
Independence as well.
Yes, that's a lesson in itself for not just young people, but for all of us, really.
Absolutely.
And then came your second book, Africa on My Mind.
Yes, so the whole idea, you know, too many of us, we start our history with slavery. And so with my first book, we wanted to introduce children and adults to their history prior to slavery so that they can learn about the accomplishments of their ancestors. And then in 1993, I traveled to Ghana, Senegal, Gambia, and the Ivory Coast. And after returning from that trip, wrote
hold that up again.
Africa on My Mind, Reflections of My Second Trip. And so in this book, I talk about my travels to Ghana, Senegal, Gambia, and the Ivory Coast, and essentially make that connection, how we got from Africa to the Americas and what that experience was like.
Now, who's the graphic artist here? Because the graphics on this cover just shoot out at you.
So both of these images, or these are pictures of real images. So I was standing in front of Abu Simbel with my arms stretched wide. This cover was done by Malcolm Aaron, and then my second book was illustrated by Kevin Watson. The cover was.
Wow, he's great. He's wonderful. Bad boy. Wow, because I mean both of those covers just shoot out at you, really. Now you have a new publication.
Yes.
That you're sharing, and it's called
Reflections of My First Trip to Africa. And so this was just released on January 1st of this year, 2020. And essentially, it is a revision. Much of the narrative is similar, but I've included an older voice.
You're grown now.
I'm grown, right? All grown up. But I've, since my first trip in '89, I've traveled back at least 13 or 14 times. And so every trip that I take, I'm always learning something new. I'm coming back with new experiences and knowledge that help to make each trip different. Absolutely. Yeah. And so I've also included, information about my recent travels to Egypt over the years, as well as my involvement in the Asa Restoration Project.
Yeah. Now let's talk about that, because that's so very important. Let's talk about the.
Yeah, so the Asa Restoration Project was founded in 2008 by my father, Anthony Browder, and the purpose of the Asa Restoration Project was first and foremost to honor the work and legacy of the great Dr. Asa G. Hilliard III, and the other purpose of the project was to help restore the 25th dynasty, the Kushite dynasties that ruled in Egypt during the late kingdom. And so at this point, we are celebrating over 10 years of excavation, of conservation, of discovery.
So for people who might like to contribute to that effort, how could they do that?
So they can go to our website, which is ikg-info.com. And even before you contribute, because we want people to understand the significance of this work, and how their funds are actually helping to keep this project going. So we started off the project almost 10 years ago with with tools from like the Stone Age, but now with the support that we've got, we're able to buy newer tools that help us get the job done even faster.
I seen some of the pictures. I was like, ooh, boy. I was like, ooh, just look at that picture, made me claustrophobic. But I mean, how do you?
So that picture that you're referring to, what most people are familiar with, is the image of my dad and I in the burial chamber of Karakamoon, who's a 25th dynasty priest.
Who took that picture?
If I'm not mistaken, I believe it was Brother Quayle, who's been with us for a long time, as a part of our team. Yeah.
So what's it like when you're in that tomb, when you're down there and you're digging?
Well, first and foremost, this was my first time being part of an active archaeological mission. So, I didn't know what to expect. I had no idea what we would find. But just the idea of being in a tomb that's 2,700 years old. It's not from the Ptolemaic period. It's not from the Roman period. This temple tomb was built by African men and women. And my father and I had a chance to spend about a week in the burial chamber excavating. And, it was an interesting experience for two reasons. One, I had this feeling, we're in this tomb, digging this stuff up, and, should we be here? Is this something we should be doing? And, it never failed. Every season that we went, there was always some type of confirmation to let us know that this is
on the right path.
We were on the right path, absolutely.
Wow. Yeah. Well, so other people in your team, they felt the same thing, right?
Absolutely. Sometimes I feel like I don't get excited enough, and I know for me it takes time to really hit me. But I'm really...
The importance of that word, though.
I mean, the most important thing is that we have an opportunity to not only write history, but also rewrite or correct many of the mistakes of history as it relates to our history, African history.
Yeah, to say the least. Because I mean, that project, man, I'm just impressed with the pictures that I'm seeing. Because you know, you and your dad, of course, come every year to Union Temple for Kwanzaa, and y'all lay it out for us. And what's so impressive was the timeline that your dad had. Oh, that's so impressive. How'd y'all come up with that timeline?
Well, that's actually something that a brother in the UK developed some years ago. And, you know, I can't speak for him, but I could presume that one of the reasons why he created that timeline was to give people a visual representation. Oftentimes, we don't have a good understanding of the chronology
of it,
of Egypt or Kemetic history. And so when you can put things into
different
perspective,
dynasties.
exactly. And then when you look at that timeline, you see that there's over, you know, 2,000 years of African history and culture, you know, and it wasn't until, you know, the Persians, the Greeks and Romans come in that we see this.
You know, when I first met Dr. Asa Hilliard through your dad, and I did this recording at that time we was recording on cassette tapes, and then when I converted them, it was like 3 or 4 CDs, and he talked about the chronology of African history, the different dynasties. That's the first thing he laid out at the beginning of his lecture, and it was just amazing. And to hear you saying that's the importance of laying out that chronology, because we don't know. And looking at that long thing how long is it?
It's probably about 9 feet or so, at least.
10 feet. Yeah, and it's just amazing, man. When I seen that. In fact, I have one. I took it to work and laminated it, really. But anyway.
And I'm sure it's a nice topic of discussion.
Oh, yes, it is. It definitely is. It's a conversation piece, if you will. There's a lot there. There is so much there when you look at it. You know, and it also reminds me there's so much that's been kept from us as a people as well.
And the question is why? Why has our information? And that we can say that for another conversation. But the most important thing for our people to understand or to do is to ask questions. Just not accept information. You know, my father always told me. I don't remember what scholar he learned it from, but he said whenever you're going to talk about information, it's important to have at least 3 sources.
Yes.
Too many of us out here, you know, read one book and all of a sudden we're experts.
We're scholars.
Right, yeah.
One book, please.
So
how many books did Dr. John Henry Clark, did Dr. Ben read? Oh, God.
Hundreds, I'm sure, thousands and thousands of books over their lifetime.
Yes. Scholars. Yeah. So when I think about that, you know, it takes so much more to just, you know, you just don't want to be surface. You know, you want to go in depth with this knowledge, because if you're going to do it, then do it all the way.
And even though I've been doing this work for some time, as I continue to learn and grow, I realize how much I don't know. And I think that's what a wise man truly understands, that there's so much more information out there that we don't know. But that is the purpose of life, to learn, to grow, and most importantly, teach others.
There's a poem that I like to share at this point. It's simply entitled, What Color Was Jesus? Let the Holy Spirit of truth color you higher. In his divine holiness, Jesus was the black Messiah. If the naked truth is the living light, there ain't no way Jesus could have been white. Mother Mary was a sister lady. Jesus was a brother man. Now tell me, what color was Jesus? Tell me if you think you can. What colors was Jesus? Jesus was a black man. Michelangelo changed the world with a lovable white lie, and our slice of life was only pie in the sky. But a whitewashed truth is like no truth at all, for truth crushed to earth will still stand tall. Mother Mary was a sister lady. Jesus was a brother man. Now what color was Jesus? Tell me if you think you can. What color was Jesus? Jesus was a black man. Without self-knowledge, self-worth, and mutual trust, everybody seems to know who we are except us. The fact that Jesus was black is simply wholly taboo, but the truth is on its way and too long overdue. What color was Jesus? Jesus was a black man.
All right.
That's from the first book of Daniel, first chapter, first verse. Yeah, that's part of history. I mean, there's so much much history, as you're saying, that we've missed, and that we missed out for a whole lot of reasons. Matter of fact, it was Dr. John Henry Clark. I heard him say in the lecture. He said, in the middle passage, we're going to start at 100 million that we lost in the middle passage alone. That's what I heard Dr. King say. Dr. Clark said. Yeah. Now, from your books, let's talk about the other book on the end. Because we're going to do a reading, right?
Yeah, so I'll do a reading from my newest book, but
Okay.
this is my father also reminds me. He said, you just did your third book, Reflections of My First Trip, but
Mhm.
you've also created 2 additional pieces.
Oh,
One
well, let's
which,
talk about it. All of it,
most
yes.
people are not familiar with,
Mhm.
but this is the second year that we are doing the National Cultural Imperative Program.
Okay, and what is it?
And this is a program that is specifically geared for high school students, African American high school students. And this is a program in which young people meet once a month over the course of 5 months, and they read from the Browder file, select articles from the Browder file.
Mhm.
And what I've done when I joined the team a couple of years ago, I used my experience as an educator, my knowledge and experience as an educator to design a
So
curriculum.
is this like a workbook?
This is a curriculum.
Oh, it's a curriculum.
So we have, I did bring the
okay.
other book, but this is the teacher's guide. So we have a teacher's guide and
wow.
we have a student workbook.
For the
So
Browder
over
files.
the course of the 5 months, students will complete various activities within the student
Now, is that
workbook.
being incorporated in some school systems?
So that's the goal. Right now, this program is open to anybody in the community who wants to bring this program to their city. And so we also recognize that we need to get this out there and get this into the school system. So that is our goal, to get this hopefully into PG County school system, DC public school system.
Now, you've spoken to young people all over the country.
Yeah.
What kind of reactions you get when you introduce this to young people?
Well, I feel that it's always been a positive response ever since I can remember doing presentations at the age of 8 years old. But I think what I enjoyed most is how excited children got. This was the first time they had heard this information, and they just, you could kind of see that fire, just kind of, burning inside of them, that they, their identity is reinforced. They feel confident to actually call themselves an African or African American, and just the pride that I see children, develop as a result of learning this information. And as I got older and working with, high school students and college students, for many of them, I get the same reaction. They just they begin to have questions. They become very inquisitive.
About everything.
About everything, about religion, about life. So many things that they've learned over the years. They begin to ask questions, because they've been taught to just accept what an adult is.
Well, yeah, that's what education does. That's what traditional education does. You just accept something, because they say so. And the other thing is that, our history didn't begin with slavery. Where did we get that? That's what we taught.
And, I think if anything, we have to distinguish the difference between education and schooling. Because a real education teaches a people how to think, how to write, how to reason. But schooling simply molds you into a person who will simply be controlled and to work for others, and really to not be an independent thinker and doer.
Yes, and that's the key right there, to be an independent thinker and to think for yourself.
And
that's
I
always
think
the goal.
Carter G. Woodson said it best, that we have 2 types of education.
Yes.
We have the formal education, which we receive, traditionally in school.
Yes.
But the most important education is that which we give ourselves, which most people do not get or seek until they graduated from high school or college.
I like when he says, if you control a man's mind, you don't have to worry about his action. The great Carter G. Woodson, who's the father of Black history. Yeah, and he wrote many, many, many books. I think that book was written in the 20s or the 30s somewhere, but it's been a long
Education
time.
of the Negro.
Of the Negro, yes. Great, great book. And of course, he's known as the father of Black history. Yes. So with the Cultural Initiative Program, that's a great guide to get started for young people.
And so the purpose of the program is to help young people become critical thinkers, and to help them become more culturally aware of African history.
So people who may be interested, even independent schools who may be interested in that, how could they get in touch?
So they can contact us directly at 301-853 2465. Right now, we have this material available for the sites that are hosting it. And so at some point, we will make it available to the public. They wouldn't necessarily have a formal cultural imperative site, IKG CIP site, but they still will have access to the information to work with their children at home. You know, I know there's a lot of homeschoolers,
yes.
Right? So this is a perfect resource
Yes.
to continue that education.
And that's so very important. So we're going to do a reading at this time?
Okay. So I would like to do a reading from my newest book, Reflections of My First Trip to Africa. And, you know, I was thinking last night, I was working on a presentation that I'll be doing this weekend, actually tomorrow in Philly, and I'll give some more information.
Okay.
But I was just thinking about the importance of symbolism. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, we often just see, you know, symbols as something pretty and decorative, but they have so much more meaning.
Yeah.
And so I'll read this excerpt from page 15, where I talk about my travel to Giza.
Okay.
So Haramakhet, which most people know as a sphinx, is a symbolic statue because we all know that lions do not have human heads. The human head represents the divine intellect or intelligence that is born in every person. The body of a lion represents the lower animal nature, which causes people to make bad decisions and get into trouble when they do not think and act wisely. So when you see this human head on a lion's body, it reminds us that when you know yourself, your history, you know that you were born with a purpose. You know that your life matters and that you must use your divine God-given intellect to overcome your lower animal nature. Haramakhet was a symbol that reminded the people of Kemet of the qualities that every human being possessed. Haramakhet can teach us how to bring out the God within so that we could create heaven on earth like our ancestors did thousands of years ago. Like Haramakhet, we can do anything great when we are focused, disciplined, and divinely inspired.
Wow, it's beautiful. And that's a reading from your new book, Reflections of My First Trip to Africa.
Yes.
Wow. Now, have you done, I know your fathers have done, you know, lectures. Y'all have recordings also.
So we have DVDs of various lectures that we've done over the years. Yes.
Wow, and that's important as well.
Yes.
Yeah, you didn't bring any, and I didn't bring any, so, but it's all good. So people who like to get in touch with you or your dad,
yeah,
how
so
can
they
do
can
that?
do that in two ways. They can go to our website, which is ikg-info.com.